Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's keynote lecture. My name is Philipp Rohrbach, and I'm a research fellow at the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies in Vienna, Austria. I've been working and publishing on the life stories of Austrian children of Black American soldiers and Austrian women for quite a time now. And in this context, I curated also an exhibition called Schwarz Österreich, die Kinder afroamerikanischer Besatzungssoldaten, together with my colleague Nico Weir, and our keynote speaker Vanessa was also part of this exhibition. She worked also on this exhibition. And further, I published also in 2021 with Ingrid Bauer an issue of the journal Zeitgeschichte on the topic Black GI children in post-World War II Europe, and I'm also a member of the Black Transnational Adoption Network that was initiated by Rosemary Pena, and all that in combination explains somehow why I'm moderating today's keynote. But enough about me. Let me introduce our speaker to you. Vanessa Spanbauer was born in 1991 in Vienna. She's a journalist and a historian. Vanessa was, until last year, the chief editor of the magazine Fresh, Black Austrian Lifestyle. She has worked on numerous exhibitions and projects, such as the previously mentioned exhibition Schwarz Österreich, Black Austria. But she was in 2018 also a research associate in the project Blackening Vienna, aspects of African presence in Vienna since 1918, and she's currently working on and researching holdings of colonial provenance in Austrian federal museums. Beyond her professional activities, Vanessa Spanbauer is also a clearly articulated voice that can be heard or seen on a regular basis in the Austrian media landscape, especially when it comes to topics like feminism, minority issues, racism, and the questions of Black Austrian identity and politics. So I'm glad that we have a specialist here giving and presenting the keynote lecture today, a keynote lecture about Black Austrian resistance and protests. And before I give the floor to Vanessa, just a little remark. Should questions arise during the presentation, please write them in the Q&A section, because that makes it easier for us to integrate them in the discussion afterwards. So Vanessa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will try to set my PowerPoint presentation first. Yeah. Hello, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Philipp. But also thank you very much that I was invited to this conference, also because it's the 10th anniversary, and I'm really have to congratulate you about putting together this whole program, because there is a lot of great content that we could hear, and I'm very glad that I'm part of it. So thank you very much. Thank you very much to Rosemary and team also. For today, I will talk a bit about Black Austrian resistance, which is a topic that we heard yesterday, actually, in some part. I would also like to thank Aurebach Johnson-Arthur, because she also introduced us to one important part of Austrian Black resistance in the 60s. And I would really like to shine a light also again on Aurebach Johnson-Arthur, because her presentation was very, very great and great insight into the topic. In my presentation, I would like to focus a little more on the general history of Black Austrian resistance. I will show it in a few parts, a few little stories. I will share a few stories and with you today, and yeah, I hope you have a little bit of insight for all of it. I'm trying to get this bigger.
Vanessa, if you can, just hit animation, right? That's the one. There you go. You got it.
Perfect. Now I have it. Thank you very much. In introducing the topic of resistance, there are several questions that we can ask ourselves. What does resistance mean? I will not go into detail about what resistance means in detail, could be not a definition, but some key points that I always thought about was concepts of how resistance can be done and also what comes with it. One part that's touched on in this presentation is the question of, could a resistance be also alone, an act of one person, or does it have to be together? And what is the difference? Another part was a protest. Is resistance always a protest? Or sometimes can resistance, especially being Black, just be about being Black, living a life, not going actively to protest and protesting something, but just living your life? Is that part of resistance as well in a country like Austria, where there are mostly white people? What does resistance mean? Does resistance have to be seen by a large number of people? Or can resistance also be just talking to each other, and that you as a group know that you now have resistance in place? Or does it have to be seen by the media, by everyone, by white people especially? What does resistance also mean from the standpoint of coming together offline or online? Because in the past years, like I'm guessing everyone, and also that we are here today online, there is a huge shift on what coming together can mean. And then writing history yourself or being written about. What kind of stories do we know? What kind of stories don't we know, basically? I start with a point that is a big starting point of Austrian history in all of the time, because the first Black person that we know the name of is Angelo Suleiman. The first Black person that we know was actively resisting was his daughter. Angelo Suleiman was the first Black man that we know the name of. There were Black people in Austria before that, but he was just the first one that we kind of have documentation about. So we know who he is. We have a portrait. That is something that we didn't have of many, many others. We don't have a portrait of his daughter, really. That's why his portrait is here. But she was the one that was actively resisting, because her father was on the Austrian Habsburg court. So he was in close proximity of a court of the monarchy. And he actually was very valued and liked in his time. However, when he died, they did not bury him. They did not give him it's on one hand an honor, on the other hand, just normal treatment when you die, that you have a funeral and everything besides that. He didn't get that. They put off his skin and put his remains in a museum for everybody to see, because yeah, he was valued, but he was Black also, which was something that they never can forget in the Austrian court. They wanted to look at him. They wanted to look at his body, like Black bodies being watched is something we know. We know throughout history that is something that never stopped happening. And in this instance, his dead body was put into a museum. His daughter tried to fight for the right of her father to being buried, to have a funeral. She was actively trying to resist, trying to write to people to get his body released from the museum, to actually have a funeral for her father. That is the first act of resistance that we really can pinpoint. Oftentimes, that is the first point of resistance that we actually know about, that we know details about, that we can have a reference to. Sometimes it's hard in Austrian history, Austrian Black history, and Austrian history in itself, because Black history is Austrian history, when you have to start at somewhere and not just say, you know, there were Black people then and there. But that was a point where we can start, and we can also show, no, yeah, treat it like an object, but all of those people did something. They were people, they were subjects, they were people that were actually acting, resisting. But the question of who is able to resist and in which parts can people resist is also something that we always have to think about, because back in those times, and that was the 1800s, there was not much of much of a choice for you to resist in that kind of society that you were born into. Also, the next story, that it's a little snippet. I'm just going by snippet by snippet by snippet and then trying to, finish it off. You have a snippet of a person that was actually in a so-called Ashanti village. In whole of Europe, people from the African continent, in this case West Africa, were put in so-called zoos, human zoos, Menschenschauen. That was also something that was very popular in Vienna, actually. In the beginning of the 19th century, there were several of those human zoos, Menschenschauen, in Vienna. And people, white people, wanted to see Black bodies, but like they want to perceive Black bodies. Naked in villages, caged, that was what they thought a Black body should be like, should be in this kind of village setting for them to look and for them to experience something. We don't have much documentation of the people that were in those villages, so-called villages. We don't know much about what they thought about their life, what happened to them, how they actually lived, except for one that I could find. There was actually an author called Peter Altenberg. He's a problematic person in itself, but the one thing that he gave us was documentation of people. He talked to people in those settings, in those so-called villages. And one of the people in there, a man, he said, yeah, it's wrong, basically, that they were caged in like this, because he reflected upon that in Africa, it wouldn't be like that. They would laugh. In Africa, there is no such village. We're not naked. We're not depicted in an authentic way, because only dogs live this way in Africa. So in the beginning of the 19th century, there were actually people saying, yeah, 20th century basically 1900s. Yeah, we didn't live like this, actually. It was not our lifestyle. This is not an authentic picture of Africa you're reflecting into the Austrian society. And I think this source says is very strong, because that's the same thing that many people that are fighting today also try to get an image of Africa into the Austrian society that depicts something different than people in a village, small village, and then being naked and maybe hungry. That's an image of Africa that many people in Austria still have. And a lot of people, projects, activists today try to get rid of that image. So it tells us something if somebody, and we don't know what happened to this man, said that so many 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, that this is not the way that Africa actually is. This is one little snippet of resistance that I could find about this time. But the most important part of it is we don't know a lot. We only have this because a white author decided he wants to write about it. What we don't have is their voices authentically, with their own words, with any trace of they can speak and write something or speak something, or we have no way to actually know how they really, really felt. We all see this, and that's a quote that I really like, that we have it, but also it's through a white lens. We don't really have much info. I'm trying to get, yeah. Another topic, because then comes a time where we also have a different kind of documentation, a different kind of resistance, and a different, different kind of way that you could resist. This shows a document and documentation of the Nazi regime, actually, that documented a Black person. He's in some records depicted as mixed, that he lived in Vienna. He was a 21-year-old mechanical assistant called Heinrich Macac, and he was arrested actually in 1939 on the charge of Heimtückengesetz. They claimed that he made hateful and malicious claims that show his sentiments towards the Nazi regime, because he actually said that, I'm trying to quote a little bit, that Hitler came crawling to the Russians because he doesn't know what to do no more. But everything will change. Hitler will go away and another government is coming. Then everything will change. Workers will have a better life because currently they are treated like filth. Everything is changing. And that's something that he said very openly in the middle of the Nazi regime. He had the resistance in a way that even in those times where it was very hard to say anything, he did. He did, and he said it, and he said it that a lot of people could hear it. For that, he was put in front of a judge, and he was actually sentenced to prison time. However, he also came out. It's important to know a little bit about the background, because we don't know a lot about Black people in this era. What we do know that definitely died in this time in Austria. Some lived. We have documentation of people that were put in concentration camps and got out. What we don't really have, sometimes we do have it, is the why they were in those concentration camps. Sometimes it was a political reason. It wasn't always the reason of that they were Black, which to us, thinking about it, would make a lot of sense that it was actually racial reasons that they tried to put people away. But it wasn't always the case, like in this case, where they said he's a communist, and we have a problem because he says a lot of things against us in a communist sympathetic way, and we really have to silence him. However, they didn't really succeed because he said it again. And then later they actually did arrest him again because he was out with white women. So he went and was out and partied with white women. And that was something that you can now see. First came the political reasons, then came the racial reasons why they tried to put him away and also silence him. We don't really know what happened to him. However, he got free. The only thing we know, he got free when the war was over. That is another case of resistance, and a case where we know that he resisted because the regime had documentation. So we have the documentation of resistance because the Nazi regime did document everything, and a lot of it. So that's another part of sources we have, not from the people themselves, but from governments and regimes that are very problematic. That was a point also yesterday in another context, but that's another part of resistance that we know we don't really know a lot about yet. So that's still an ongoing, I think, research projects will be dedicated to all of it. After the war, there was a different era. In this era, there were children, Black Austrian occupation children. That's a project. This is the cover of the book for the exhibition, which was introduced by Philipp Rohrbach before, because he researched this topic and we put out the exhibition for it. And in this catalog, actually, and in the whole exhibition, there were different kinds of resistance that could be found. In this instance, it was also a resistance that came from people that were very much isolated. This is a picture of many children, many Black children, but this was actually not usually the case. A lot of these children, and those are children, there were 350 to 400, about that were born in Austria, that have a white Austrian mother and a Black GI father. And they were born during the occupation time. Those children had to actually live in a white society. It was a society after the Holocaust with still the mindset in place. Very racist society. And those children, now definitely not children no more, but those children had to find ways how to resist in a small way, how to resist in school, how to resist in the village they were born into, how to resist in every little in every little part of it, because growing up, and we all know this, growing up as a Black person in white society could be incredibly hard. There are some stories in this book of people that are resisting in a way that they're just trying to articulate a very good German, because nobody thought that they were actually Austrian. So they tried to fight what people thought of them into articulating very perfect German, because they were Austrian kids after all. So they could do that, but people didn't think of that actually. Or people finding the way into a work life, or all different parts of how you could resist as a person for yourself, actually, to live a life that is quite okay for yourself in the society, in a racist white society. So I think that shows that also little parts of resistance and little actions that you take for yourself, I would claim that is also Black Austrian resistance, because a lot of different acts of resistance could be resistance. I will not, and that's something that our Evelyn Johnson Arthur, thank you for listening, and yeah, go back to work. Really thankful for work, because that was in the 50s, but after in the 60s, we heard a lot about the resistance in the 60s from her before in the talk that was yesterday, and I'm guessing and I'm hoping that everyone could then go to the recording and hear the important work about the resistance in the 60s, because that's something that I don't share with you today, because I think like I could not go into detail like Professor Auerbach, Evelyn Johnson Arthur did yesterday. So I will go and pick up in the 90s. The 90s and beginning of 2000s were big in Austria, actually, because in resistance in Black history, because a lot of people lived through police brutality. A lot of people knew what it was. In the 90s, a lot of people came to Austria. That for context reasons, there were more Black people coming in the 60s because there were students or there were embassies being set up. But then in the 90s, a lot of people came for also to study, to have a new life. A lot of people came to Austria, a lot of Black people. So police reacted. Police always reacted, but it became a real issue that there were actually police brutality in place at that time. There was a first protest against police brutality actually in March of 1999. And in this protest, the Black community came together and said, it has to stop. We have to fight it. It cannot go like this anymore. Thing is, it was a protest, but it wasn't completely big. It was a big protest by a lot of important people that joined in and said, in the Black community, and said, you know, it's not an issue we can ignore any longer. However, it wasn't a protest that the media really picked up or anybody really picked up from the white part of society. Soon after, on the 1st of May 1999, Marcus Omofuma was killed. Marcus Omofuma was a man, a Nigerian man, who should have been brought back to Nigeria, and in the flight from over Bulgaria, they actually put tape on his mouth and put him on the seat in the plane. put tape over his mouth and his nose, and he actually couldn't breathe anymore. So he died on the flight there. What followed in media was a whole campaign that the media wanted to show why it was not the police's fault that he was actually killed. Because media decided, and especially Kronenzeitung, which you also have some little snippets here, decided with the police and the FPÖ, which is a very a big part of Austrian politics and politic party that has a history of racism within itself. They decided they have to do a media campaign to actually show why it wasn't the police's fault, because he was aggressive. He was an aggressive person. They really tried to put, didn't make him the victim, but the police essentially, and really tried to criminalize a person. What turned into was a whole campaign against Black people in general, because there was another protest after that the Black communities actually organized and came together and were like, okay, now we really, really have to protest again. Now something happened a few months after the first protest. The thing was that the police decided to make everyone that attended the protest another criminal. What followed was called Operation Spring. That was a whole campaign against people that were being watched, that were being listened to. And the police tried to frame all of the people attending protests and said, like in some before, 100 Nigerians, they all have to do with drugs. They all have to do with drugs. That, and people that were arrested within this campaign against a lot of Black people that attended protests, silenced the protest. Because, yeah, you then are afraid to be loud, to be on the street, to fight for your rights, to fight for everything, because you can go to jail because of that, for just attending a protest, to just be loud in the street, because they try to frame you after that. That was one thing that silenced the protest, but it never really went away. Also in 2003, when the next case of police brutality, there were a lot in between, but that was the next case where police actually did police, and not just police, but other kind of like ambulances and other parts of Austrian, of the Austrian whole political system were responsible for another death of a Black man called Sabane Wagwe. There were then a lot of people again coming together, protesting in different ways. I think, and I always say that, those cases brought Black people together in a way that it hasn't been seen before, because everyone knew that that being Black in Austria, it has an effect. It triggered a lot of conversation, a lot of media attention, especially Black men being framed as being drug dealers. This image is in the media and in our, still today. This is something that never went away. Also, there were protesting after that in different kinds of places, protesting art, protesting festivals. Pomocha, which is the movement of the young African diaspora in Austria, big player in connecting people, especially the second generation of Black people in Austria, were a big player in different kind of protests. They protested the police brutality, but they also protested different cultural phenomenons. Because in 2014, for example, there was a play at a festival called Wiener Festwochen, which is like very high culturally festival, that was called the N, but like written out. And Pamoja was a player that said, no, it's not okay, that actually protested this, this play. There was another play that has a little bit of a history in Austrian, in the Austrian cultural sector. There was another play in 2018, so not that long ago, that also had the N-word in the title, and then the book that actually put the N-word everywhere. They put the N-word on posters in the whole city, so everybody had to read the N-word. That was also protested in 2018. Also protested was in 2017 a sale. It was tribal art and curiosity sale at Dorotheum, which is an auction house. And this auction house wanted to sell human remains of people from non-European descent. It wasn't just Africa. It was, I think, one was Nigeria. There was also from Peru, from the Philippines. There were skin. It was bones, it was hair of people that they wanted to have in a curiosity sale. I think the title alone speaks a lot. And people were trying to get together to actually contest that this should not be able to be in place in Austria. Because in different parts of Europe, it's actually not allowed anymore to sell human remains. In Austria, it still is possible. Also, a lot of people try to protest something like a label that is called actual company logo, Julius Meindl. And this company logo has a Black person. It reminds us of the colonial past, but also this logo was altered in a lot of other racist ways, like people, like a Black person that has to serve somebody and stuff like that. That is in a shop in Austria, big shop, and on coffee, and it's a big brand. There were a lot of initiatives and people like Simon Inu, who made another logo, which is in the middle here, who said, no, you cannot do that. We have to resist it, recreate a different kind of logo. What can be seen, that sometimes it takes time. That was in the beginning of the 2000s, 2005, where he actually tried to get this logo changed. After Black Lives Matter now, they changed it. They actually did. So the last one is the logo that is used at the shop, because they took only the fats, only the hat, and took the Black person out. However, it's not completely done, but resistance can do something over time. I would also try to highlight Nicht mit uns, which was a different case of police brutality, but racial profiling. There were guys that the guy in the photo is actually a rapper, and he was just having his band meeting, musical meeting in a park. 5 Black people in the park. And those Black people were just sitting and just working on their laptops, going by their day, and police came, because one Black person, okay, you know, police, maybe they can let it, but a group of Black people, 5 Black people in the park, it's too much for Austria, too much for Vienna. So the police came and actually tried to get their passports and what are they doing here and who are they. and tried to actually get information from them. They gave the information. It was still not enough. They called more police. I think there were 10 police officers at that place and always came back. The one act of resistance was being there, just living, existing, but another one was he recorded the whole thing and it went viral, actually, what the police are doing to Black people. It was a whole different media attention on this one case. And he actually, the problem is that he ended up being charged and having having to pay, actually, because he filmed the police and put a Snapchat filter like a bunny ears on them to make fun of them. So he had to pay in the end for all of that, and they didn't get any kind of repercussion, anything. The one thing that actually, and I'm trying to come to an end, that was very, very important for Austria was Black Lives Matter. All of the parts of resistance before, especially from the 90s onwards, did something. It was always there. Every part of resistance, young Black people, older Black people, we all remember it. And when George Floyd, when we all saw the video of George Floyd, it did something to us, like it did to a lot of people around the world. It did not only trigger to look at police brutality in the US and really think about it and really look, because we also know that history, but also it reminded us of our cases of police brutality. We had Omofuma, we had Wague, both couldn't breathe anymore, basically, because the police taped their mouth or was standing on them and stuff. So it reminded us of our own history. And that triggered 50,000 people, which is so many people from Vienna. It was one of the biggest demonstrations that Vienna had ever seen to any topic in the middle of the pandemic. 50,000 people came to the protest. Nobody thought that was ever possible. People that organized this were planning to 4,000 people. So they had like the speakers on and something to 4,000, 50,000 came the next day, 10,000 came. In different parts of Austria, also people tried to raise awareness and organize protests. So in whole, in the summer of 2020, about 100,000 people attended Black Lives Matter protests, not only shining a light of Black Lives Matter to, not only having the protesting police brutality in the US, but also in Austria, and also racism as a whole in Austria. What followed now are a lot of different initiatives and a lot of different parts of resistance again, because there were activists that now formed again in the spirit of Black Lives Matter, like Schwarze Geschwister für Power, Black Movement Austria. Also, there is a political now trying to get actually a lot of different signs for a Volksbegehren, that is a political instrument for people that have different goals, and they want to bring it for the parliament actually to be talked about. That is something that formed out of Black Lives Matter protests. So young Black people now trying to actually get to politic level and saying, no, racism is definitely not okay. It has to change on different levels, especially systemic racism. And also people having podcasts, having different kind of little other resistance So I would like to finish off with saying that there are different parts and roots of resistance in Austria. And a lot of them is just being. Some are fighting for your rights. Other are alone. Some are in groups. But the topic of resistance in Austria is something we have a legacy of it. And I think many people don't realize this when they only look at 2020 and don't look of the history of resistance, of Black resistance that Austria actually has. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think I was over time limit, but I hope I can get it in with the questions then in.
Thank you, Vanessa. It was actually right on time. Yeah, thank you for giving us this broad overview, actually from the 18th century until the present times, by highlighting episodes of Black Austrian history. We have now approximately 15 minutes for the discussion, and I just want to remind you again that if you have any questions, type them into the Q&A section of the Zoom chat. And I would like to start with the story. I mean, you highlighted certain episodes of Black Austrian history and also Black Austrian resistance. Clearly, it's became a little bit denser in the 20th century, but you talked about the problematic sources you were, or people had to use for their research, for the reconstruction of these stories. For example, you mentioned Peter Altenberg, and then clearly the pictures were taken, like the Nazi period pictures were taken, I think, by the Rassenamt or other Nazi authorities. But what was your approach during the research, handling these sources? For one thing, and the other thing is, if I understood you right, you know also about other Black Austrian history subjects, but you don't have enough sources to cover them or to reconstruct them. So could you tell us a little bit more about these other parts of Black Austrian history as well?
Yeah, sure. A lot of times the problem is that we do have sources. Sometimes we don't have a lot of sources. The whole source, that is a problem, that we know sometimes of stories. We have little snippets here and there, somewhere mentioned maybe, but no real source of it, which is something that is a problem. And I think in a lot of different parts of research, we have this problem. However, in the case of Black Austrian history as a whole, the problem oftentimes is that the sources are by white people. The sources are provided by authorities, are provided by individuals that try to depict a certain point and reduce a person sometimes on a certain point of their existence and have a certain lens looking at Black people. For a long time, we only have source material written by white people. And then the shift, I think, it changes in the 60s, that a lot more Black people actually start to write something. And then in the 90s, we have a big awareness of Black existence through the lens of Black people, actually. And so it changes the narratives, because Black people themselves, if they write about themselves, it's a whole different story. And I think that's something also with social media now, that is actually a big change, because we can tell our own stories. Sometimes it doesn't have to be the person who writes something down in a history book and has the publishing deal sometimes, but we can record something. We put on an Instagram account now, or before that, there were email lists and stuff. So I think the change to more stories written by Black people is a big one, and I wish that we would uncover a lot more sources like Robert Johnson Arthur also did for the 60s, that are written by Black people themselves.
Thank you. So there are a few questions in the chat or in the Q&A section. So one question is if you know of any specific laws besides drug claims that were created or unequally used to mistreat Black Austrians?
It was a lot of drug claims, a lot of claims of people who be the drug like boss. There was one person framed as being the conspirator against all of it. There were different people claimed for also, I think, which is something that happens in these times again. Black shops, for example, if you have a hair shop, like or a shop that a restaurant or something, they try find ways to get you on another claim, like you did something wrong with your books, for example, or so, if you had a hair shop or something like that, which is also something that happens nowadays too. And a lot of Black people don't really have a fear, an instilled fear because of the 90s for authorities and for fear against police. And a lot of people don't really, in the certain generation, because younger people speak up, and the second generation says a lot of different, it's a different kind of resistance in the second generation, because they claim, I'm Austrian, you cannot do anything against me. But the first generation was silenced in those times a lot. And we still have a lot of people that don't really speak up a lot.
Okay, thank you. So I would like to combine two questions, like one of my questions with one of the Q&A section questions. I mean, you told us a little bit about the developments after 2020, after this like big manifestation. But what would you say, like, what effects have the BLM protests had on Austrian activists? And I would say also probably on the majority population, because I remember that it was widely covered by Austrian newspapers, because it seems like that the organizers were not the only ones who were surprised by the number of people that showed up at these protests. And another question is there a sense of solidarity among Black Austrians or Black people in Austria? So it's actually two questions. And what are the gender dynamics with these resistant ones?
Yeah, definitely the awareness of Black people and Black history and racism changed a lot in 2020. So there were a lot of people surprised that 50,000 people came to the protest, especially the media, who tried for the first days to frame the whole Black Lives Matter protest story into, yeah, people now in the US damaging shops and such. That was Austrian media basically on the Black Lives Matter protests and the take Austrian media had and took. Then 50,000 people were in the street and they were like, okay, now that narrative, we cannot keep with that. We have to actually maybe now ask Black people in Austria what they think about all of this and what they think about racism in Austria, because everyone that was being asked on TV did not stop about talking about the US. Everyone was like, yeah, in the US, this and this and this is the issue, but in Austria. And so they couldn't stop it. So I think there was a big part of solidarity before Black Lives Matter in Black communities, because a lot of people came together in different kinds of, sometimes it was just having a party and just, being together in a peaceful way, in peaceful for ourselves, to just eating something or listen to music together. But the sense of solidarity always has been there. However, I think we were now more connected because there were like people everywhere, and people, yeah, I can follow this person on Instagram, especially young people that maybe were living not in the cities, because in the cities, I think a lot of people are connected, but if you don't live in the city in Austria, it still is like a very lonely experience for a lot of people. So I think that connected everybody together. And in the gender dynamic, there are different kinds of layers to that. I cannot speak for everything in this like context, but I think it made something else, to the forefront, because in the 90s, there were a lot of Black men being framed as drug dealers. And that's a whole dynamic in itself, but also the women were the ones that were actually thinking about all of this, what happens in this respect, having different struggles, also with society and how society treats and watches Black women. However, I think also listening to each other is something that we learned, and that has always been there. And I think gender dynamic is something that we have to take a closer look in the future. I'm not an expert on that respect, but I think there are different kinds of dynamics everywhere that are interesting, but I feel as Black people, we really came together being, and it didn't really matter what gender we had, it mattered that we were here and for each other, basically.
So we have a couple of minutes left before we have to close this session. Unfortunately, we're not able to answer all the questions we still have, but probably a historical question. The photo on the Schwarzösterreich catalog. Can you tell us a little bit more about the context? And the second thing, you didn't mention it in your lecture, but I mentioned it in the beginning. Can you give us really like a short insight, brief insight in your work on researching holdings of colonial provenance in Austrian federal museums? Because this is a debate you have in Germany, you have it Europe wide. Where is Austria at the moment? What are dominant themes, controversial points? What is the Austrian situation, so to say?
Actually, the photo of the group of Black Austrian children is something that Philipp could talk more about, definitely, more than me. But it's a group of children that were basically located in Salzburg, and they were in a foster situation, foster home. How it was a weird kind of, from the Austrian perspective, in how many kids actually in the system of adoption could be assigned to you. It was a bit weird because at a time where the kids grew up and needed to go to school, Austrian school system had a bit of a problem with them and didn't really want to have them in their school system, because they didn't, at Salzburg, it was a lot of talk about kids not fitting in, really. So they got adopted collectively together to a couple, and then went to the US. So the story of these kids is in actually this catalog that is here. If you want to have more information, I think it's good to get to the research that also Philipp made, because this group of children grew up and actually then went, some of them went back for exhibition to Austria. And I got to meet some of these children on the photo. And it's a great history of different perspectives on being born in Austria and then being in the US, and what kind of dynamic of being Black, being Austrian, then going to the US, being Black, being mixed, what all of that means. So the story is a bit of a complicated one to condense into a short time span. But yeah,
I have to apologize for the second question. We're running out of time and we have to kind of end the session now.
No.
Probably you will have, I'm sorry, I a little bit underestimated the time management here, but probably you will have the chance to, I don't know, talk with conference participants in other settings about this whole thing. Yeah, the time is unfortunately over. Sorry again, Vanessa, for bringing this question up and not letting you answer. But thank you very much for this great presentation, and also thanks to the audience for the questions. We are now on a short break, 15 minutes, and I hope to see you at 2 at panel 7. So thanks again, and see you later.
Thank you.
Entschuldige, Vanessa.